Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to another episode of The Ways We Move, the podcast that highlights innovative mobility solutions and the people behind them. My name is Nicolas. I am your host on this podcast, and today I finally got to invite someone I've been really enjoying getting to know over the last few years. His name is Matt Lapin, and he works at Wiley Rein in Washington, D.C., and he understands everything when it comes down to supply chain, the current geopolitical landscape, not only here in the United States, but obviously all over the world. And so we had a really great, fascinating talk about what is going on when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to how the tariffs affecting advanced air mobility companies and other types of disruptive technologies companies. And I think we've done a really good job here because we started at a very high level, 52,000 feet, and then drilled it down to even what does it mean to now work with the military when budgets are shifting towards military and less on commercial aviation. What about Europe? What about China? What about all these things? So if you are a founder, a CEO, you're also having a hard time understanding how to maneuver these uncertain times, as we love to call them, then this podcast is perfect for you because Matt and I really get into the what is your mind frame? What kind of mind frame do you need to have to embrace the next few years? And let's be honest, this next decade, which definitely has started out to be very different from what we've had before. There's a fundamental philosophical paradigm shift here at stake. And if you understand that, you'll be able to better maneuver everything that you do for the next decade. So please enjoy this insightful conversation with Matt Lapin. And he will be back, by the way, because we will need to do a little bit of a catch up to see what else is going on in this industry. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's very important to us. And also share for anyone who might be interested. You might notice that little plus sign right there. It's because we also have a Patreon site where you can have access to all of this 40 before anybody else. There are other tiers where we go into much deeper levels of the industry. Tier 2 lets you have a sort of deep dive focus on a particular part of the industry, and could be a company, it could be anything. And then tier 3 gives you a bundle, and there's also a tier 4 that will give you a lot more. We're working towards pure business intelligence where you can get reports on any of these companies. You might want to know something about that, but stay tuned and we'll talk about that next. Well, Matt, thank you for being with us today on The Ways We Move. Tell us a little bit about who is Matt and your background a little bit. Thank you.
Sure. No, thanks for having me on, Nicholas. I think this will be a fun conversation. Well, I'll give the thumbnail sketch of how I fit into this universe. My name's Matt Lapin. I'm a counsel with Wiley Rein here in Washington D.C. law firm that is based and solely sourced in D.C. I am I guess, historically an international trade law nerd is like how to always put it. That is my longtime background coming from the international trade space. So having worked in-house, having worked for various law firms with the government as well. So that's kind of the angle that I come at a lot of this from. But in that, and I think this is where I've got involved in the advanced air mobility space, is supply chain, which is a fun term that everybody likes to toss around now. But what it means to me is, and particularly in new and emerging technologies, and this is obviously in the advanced air mobility space, but in others as well, really digging into the regulatory aspects, the policies, and really just some of the the industry specific issues that help you get your final product, and looking back all the way into the deep dark crevices of what those suppliers look like
Yes.
and how you deal with those issues to bring something to market both domestically and internationally. So that's kind of how I frame a lot of these issues and thinking. Obviously, they're all a whole ton of fun policy and legal and commercial issues to it's a Rubik's cube that we can all play around with. But I thought it would be interesting, particularly for our discussion here, to think about some of those
Yes.
aspects, to talk about some of the national security implications, both, again, opportunities as well as challenges that arise in this space as well, because, again, that's kind of my wheelhouse. And then, whatever else you want to talk about.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Matt. I mean, you've named so many things, and hopefully we'll tackle all of them. And I think the best place to start with is the 52,000-foot view of the overall view and everything. It's true. You mentioned the boogeyman. The boogeyman is supply chain. I hear this all the time. It's always the problem. It's always supply chain. It's always this, but nobody really puts a face on that supply chain. So, especially in something like a disruptive technology, the introduction of a disruptive technologies, I've seen four of them in my lifetime. Now we're talking about electric aircraft, and we're just still feeling the consequences of COVID. That little microbe that shut down the entire planet, which is really an interesting paradigm, right? So today we are now trying to look at supply chain. Traditionally, every country outsources from another country. But now, on top of it, there's an extra layer of complexities. The geopolitical landscape has changed tremendously over the last few years. Some countries are more invited than others, some others less. So tell us, what do you see at this very high level? How do you see this whole supply chain helping, hopefully, the advanced air mobility and especially making everything back into the United States as a coherent platform again?
Yeah, I mean that's it's funny you use the COVID example. It's actually really useful. Not that that was an enjoyable experience for anyone, obviously,
No.
but it was extremely instructive though,
Yes.
because it was I think the first time that many people, and even I can say, having worked in this space for a long time, we always talk about supply chain issues. That would drive sometimes when a client would call up and say, "Hey, I got this problem. We might get sued. It's because of the supply chain," and you kind of unfold what that means. But where I think everybody across all industries suddenly really had to start thinking in this truly globalized supply chain era where you have parts, components, manufacturing operations, testing, you name it, happening in any number of spots around the world, what it could then mean if some critical element in that was disrupted. Now, in that case, we were just talking about COVID. Well, that disruption was that people could not go outside. People could not go to work. People could not perform the things because there was an external barrier to it. Well, now though we're seeing, to your point, you threw in, geopolitics. Yes, the geopolitics of everything is now also impacting the supply chain. And there's a few ways in which kind of we're seeing that hit, advanced technologies generally, and then I think, advanced air mobility specifically, which we can maybe talk about like what this means. So one, like the big, you use the boogeyman. Well, the current boogeyman now is the China of it all. I mean, that is the, and again, I say that in terms of not casting aspersions on any actors here, but simply
No,
saying
no, tongue in
that,
cheek. Yeah.
that this is the conflict of our day, essentially the geopolitical conflict of our day. And a big piece of it, though, is taking place in the supply chain. And that's interesting. That's new. Previously, a lot of these issues were not, if you had a geopolitical conflict, it was between two parties, Russia, Soviet Union, and the US, who didn't have integrated supply chains. Nobody cared. It didn't matter. You weren't getting your key
Such a great
components
point.
from each other. So the impacts of what was playing out around the world in proxy battles and diplomatic relations ever didn't really hit the economics of it all because you had separate supply chains. That is not the case right now. Deeply integrated, particularly in advanced electronics and other key
Yes,
materials that go into our,
absolutely.
industry that we're talking about here, deeply integrated. So what does that now mean, practically? And I think what we see, at least what I see from, my practice is it's kind of three things that are happening both in parallel, but also that are crossing. So one is the idea of de-risking, right? The concept that both
Right.
from both the U.S. and China, and it's interesting in what about everybody else, and that's kind of what I want to come to in a second. Is we have both sort of made some decision at a high level, and the messiness is what we're all living through right now. Like we are going to more firmly establish, whether across the board or in critical industries, what we deem critical industries, our own supply chains, and try and find a way that we can, if not decouple fully, but find ways that we are now going to try and keep you out of our supply chain, that you being the US or China, and kind of keep them separate. So that is just kind of a high level imperative, and that has consequences regardless of what the policy that is being used to accomplish that. The overall concept is still we are trying to move these apart,
Yep.
right? So there's that driver. At the same time, though, I think you alluded to this, is that the complexity, as we were just talking about, the complexity of these supply chains is such that even with both parties perhaps very motivated right now, that is very difficult to do for all sorts
Yes.
of complex economic and commercial reasons that, we can talk treasuries and debt. We can go deep down the rabbit hole in
Oh,
areas
yes.
that I am certainly not an expert in, so I'm not going to get into that stuff, into macroeconomics. But at the bottom line is this is not something that's happened yet, even over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, where we've really seen this geopolitical conflict come to a head. It hasn't happened yet, and it's probably not going to happen in any sort of clean way, right? So that's just
No.
not that is
Yeah.
not, it's not going to be this just clean break and say, great, everybody, we're gone. So that's the second point. The third is then, what does that mean? That means complexity. It means complexity in how we're reacting to that high level policy imperative that I think it's not going to change anytime soon. We're certainly not going to, I don't think we see anything from the Chinese side that would say, yes, we are going to abandon that. We're going to try and reintegrate. We'll figure it out with the US. And certainly from what we see across multiple administrations in the US, across both sides of the aisle, this
Absolutely.
this appears to be one of the few areas where there is and continues to be and probably will continue to be agreement. So with that in mind, then, what are the levers and pressure points? And that's kind of what I'm spend my days thinking about, is like, okay, what is that going to mean then for an industry that is still trying to grow itself and establish what those supply chains look like, right? And I guess I'll stop and I just, maybe think about what I was just talking about. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and like, what, with those imperatives in mind, and what, you see just from like a deep industry perspective, like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? I have a few ideas and kind of what I think the critical points are, but you tell me.
You're right. It is so complex. And when you hear supply chain, you just think of something very simple. And like you said, from point A to point Z, but you don't always understand all the different points. And traditionally, it was, well, the US outsourcing things in China or in South America or elsewhere, right? But now all of a sudden, COVID really highlighted the complexity and the other parties that are all involved into that. By the way, on top of it, Europe is also going through its own problems too, and has struck different alliances across the world. So now we're trying to, if I understand well what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but we're trying to make sure that we don't just outsource in one direction, and try to make sure that we can also do not only domestically, but strike different alliances with different parts of the world, which I find that super interesting for me personally.
Yes.
And I'll give you one example. The only US companies that can make chips right now in the USA is Intel, right? Because everybody else outsources everything to everyone else, which kind of makes me wonder about NVIDIA, where they're going to go forward with that one, and Amazon too. All of this is heavily dependent on China. So now we're going back also to the 1970s, 1980s. We try to streamline businesses. We try to outsource as much as possible. Airbus was built like this. Boeing wasn't built like that. Lo and behold, 30, 40 years later, we're in a bit of a quagmire. We gotten used to this sort of relationship with a frenemy. And we're trying to figure out, how do we rebalance that? And you're right. It is a very noble goal, by the way. And it's regardless of left and right politics, right? Well, how we go about it is always a debatable issue. So yeah, I do see it exactly as that. Now we have this problem where, well, most of the components that we need to have come from China, and we have this tension with China. We're trying to redo this balance. Europe is not in a place to pick up the slack either, unfortunately. And so that leaves us with almost nothing else. Maybe India could be coming up this way. We'd love to work more with Taiwan, but then there are the problems there. It kind of leaves us in a very strange spot where, we'd love to have everything locally made here, but we know that's impossible. Data centers, we don't have enough electrical equipment to put in those data centers, let alone the electricians to go and work on these systems. So we're in a bit of an in-between phase. At least that's what I'm seeing on this side, where all the traditional outlets up until about 2 years ago were pretty straightforward, but now it's all been reworked with. And I still don't understand all that much about the tariffs, which really uberly complicates
we can talk
the
about
whole.
that. I mean, I think that is part of it. But so
Yeah,
and
it
again,
is.
I think that's actually a very useful way to think about it. Is, okay, then what in these specific industries, if now I think we have decided, or at least this is maybe one of the questions, there have been some policymakers that have decided that this is a critical sector. And I think this is one of the key things. This is going to be one of the key things for the industry to really identify how to frame this message, is that if you have been identified by policymakers as a critical industry, an industry, and by critical industry meaning one that is operating in an advanced sector where it is critical for national security, where it is critical for economic growth, meaning they see a future in this, that this is a, a viable long-term growth industry. If that pitch has been successfully made, number one, then there do seem to be, and we're seeing this again, the tariff context is useful here, but also some of the other regulatory actions I want to touch on here too, where we can see there are signs of how a policy that accomplishes, at least in the medium to long term, what they're trying to do could look, right? Because it kind of requires a few of these key elements. There has to be some agreement amongst kind of some of the key policymakers involved that this is one, critical national security, because that is the lens that most advanced technologies, it's not just advanced air mobility, if it's an advanced
Of
technology,
course.
regardless of the space it's operating in, national security is the big lens that it's being viewed through, same in China. And two, that it's long-term viable for economic growth. And it's a lot of this is that it's the idea of that economic security is national security, like that concept. So if we have that,
Absolutely.
then we have some examples of how that's playing out in the supply chain and trade context, which again, putting my trade nerd hat on, is from, you mentioned tariffs. It's interesting to see that we have seen, obviously there have been tons of trade actions thrown on the US, and then, sort of reactions, whether it be in China or other jurisdictions to those. But we do see that where, if we kind of read between the lines and we look at the headlines, then read, one step down, two steps down, there have been, with kind of the maximalist positions that have been taken up front, then once you get to those and we start seeing some negotiations, some reality checks, right? Some realizations
Yep.
that there are, for certain industries where there are critical inputs, number one, where those industries cannot function without these critical inputs. And two, there is an opportunity to negotiate potentially on those, that you have seen examples where the policies have been, like, I want to say exemptions necessarily, where it's say we're not going to apply these broad-based trade policies entirely, but you can see where, negotiations are ongoing or have happened. So obviously rare earths and critical minerals is a good example. As much as we would love to have an entirely self-sufficient supply chain from mine to magnet to, motor for, electric motors in the United States, we don't. We do not have the mining operations stood up. We don't have the processing. We don't have all the critical links in the chain. China understood this, so they took actions, in that regard. And we understood that at some point
Of
that we're
course.
going to have to negotiate on this point. So this has now become
And
a negotiation point.
yeah, who
So,
wouldn't have done that? It was an opportunity. Absolutely.
right. So with that in mind, then what you see there is, I think you're going to see an ongoing tension in this. And I mean, it's certainly it's a challenge for both countries, because obviously the U.S. can't push so far to say, all right, we don't need your your rare earths, we don't need your minerals yet. We're not at that point. That may be the case in 5 years, maybe the case in 10 years. Who knows? But I'm not an expert enough in the mining capacity and processing sector to tell you that. And I think the truth is not very many people are. So in the meantime, then we still have these advanced industries that we need to and want to support, as well as our broader industries, whether it be the auto industry or others. So there you're going to
Right.
have then in the at least near to medium term, there's going to be some ongoing uncertainty in that supply chain. But again, also perhaps some opportunity, because what that means is then, one, the US is extremely incentivized to accelerate the timelines for domestication of those, or
Yes.
for locking up friendly, quote unquote, friendly deals with other countries to source those. So again, if I'm thinking about what my supply chain looks like, if I'm a component manufacturer or if I'm an integrator and operator at the top level, I am now looking at those opportunities. I'm looking at shoring up potential sourcing from, in the US, or working maybe for getting vertically integrated with other companies, and not just, myself, but who make the motor, or the motor company who actually is sourcing the processed minerals, and looking to integrate those and locking up potential sources that are domestic or at friendly countries. So that's one thing. I think it's an opportunity that could exist for companies that can or are willing to take advantage of it. Another part of that is also getting comfortable with that uncertainty, being flexible, having the ability to have supply chains that have, 1, 2, 3 options in terms of sourcing your critical materials, because we're going to be in this realm of 5 to 10 years likely of uncertainty before there is either
Yes.
a change in the geopolitical environment or those supply chains have become secure enough that we don't have to worry about if we're mad at China or India or whoever, that we have a a secure supply chain. So I think that's a second piece of it. And then I think the third piece that comes into play is again kind of coming back to that, what those regulatory spigots, and levers are. Thinking about I can't remember who coined it. I think it might be other podcasters that I've listened to for years in the trade space have coined this. I think it's the idea of like, there's two ways that you compete globally in a marketplace. You either try to run faster or you trip the other guy. And sometimes you do both, right?
And sometimes you have to do both.
And sometimes you have to do both. But it's the same thing at the domestic. It's the same
That's
thing
true.
in any ways. There's different policy levers. It's the carrots and sticks, right? Same idea.
Absolutely.
So we have regulatory carrots, which could be incentives. Again, these incentives that we've seen in some other industry, like the CHIPS Act and in others for incentivizing domestic manufacturing in some. And then you also have the sticks, which are we are going to lock down our regulatory environment. And I think, again, there's some good examples that we've seen in particularly the drone space, which is obviously of interest to our industry here, that are examples of both very recently, like hot off the presses.
Absolutely. And that's interesting because before adding the other layer of complexities that we'll call it, military and then getting into drones, I just wanted to come back a little bit up, but it almost seems like up until now, and this is my European hat coming back online here, the way that I've seen the United States move was definitely laissez-faire, right? I mean, absolutely. You had a bunch of invested groups who would come up and say, we need this, we want to do that, or GM's old motto, whatever is good for GM is good for the rest of the world, like for the country, right? But now it seems like there is a complete change. Now it seems like the rudder of the big U.S. ship is saying, "Oh, no, 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 no. Let's come back to regrouping, refocusing." And this goes, by the way, beyond rhetoric, beyond political, right? This is just, like you said, it's national security, national economy. So it seems like we're almost going back to a more fundamental approach to running the country that goes well beyond the political spectrum of what you hear left and right. Is that a good way of coining it before we move on to military and all?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a really good way of thinking, and again framing up what the state of the industry and kind of where it might go forward. That lens of again and again when we're talking about for instance the drone context, even setting aside the military context, it's this idea of economic national security that particularly for any industry, but particularly for those emerging and advanced industries, one of the first things that is going to be looked at by regulators, policymakers, is through the lens of economic national security, which again is
absolutely,
funnily enough, it is actually going back to the idea of what's good for GM is good for America. That saying, it's just flipping it, right? It's the idea
it's flipping it.
What's good for America needs to be good for GM. So that it's taking
Perfect.
that saying, turning on its head, and then seeing, how does that work? And I think again that's what we're now kind of figuring out, and that's what I think is it something I would definitely tell, and I do maybe not in those exact terms, but when I talk to clients who are operating in the space, I do always try and provide that framework to think about, because it is important to understand that as much as a lot of times, this, we all know if we work in any industry, any business, doesn't matter who's in office, ultimately somebody's going to do something and you're going to say, God, this is so frustrating. Like if only they understood our industry better, and we can, and it's just this guy doesn't understand it. But the truth is that it's always the job. And I'm sure this is why you are here where you are. It's always the job of the industry to do two things: to educate, but also to be educated and listen and understand the policy imperatives that are being, handed. And it's got to go both ways to be effective. You obviously need to have somebody willing to listen to you. Otherwise, nothing works. But you also need to be sure you're listening to and understanding what policymakers are saying, and understanding, as we're saying, what the underlying message is. And here the message is we're telling you that what is good for our country geopolitically is you being on board with our project. That is the message. And again, I think that's pretty bipartisan at this point. There's different ways it comes out that are very different depending on the party in charge. But ultimately, that is the messaging we should all be hearing. And if we're not, then we need to listen harder, because that message is absolutely clear. And then figuring out how to put that together with our industry education to say, yes, we understand. Now let us tell you about how our industry works, and then seeing how we can put those two things together.
Right.
That fits, which is where, again, I think we were going to talk about the drone context. It's an interesting, we can see it literally happening in real time, how those
absolutely
things are meeting. So again, if we want to talk a little bit about that, I would love to chat about kind of what we're seeing there.
Yeah, no, we can always go back to that, because you're right. It is a readjustment, and that's exactly what I'm hearing on my side of the industry is, how are we going to weather these tariffs, these new means of working with other companies, countries, and things like that. That's what people are asking, basically. How do we weather the next few years? And you said it really well. This next decade, because nothing happens in 2-3 years. It happens over a decade.
It would be fantastic.
So, wouldn't that be fantastic? In 3 months, we can do this. No, not really. You can't do that. It doesn't work this way. So you've been alluding to it, and you're right. Right now, and this is something, by the way, we've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 years, is, look, it's not going to start with eVTOLs carrying people over New York City. Sorry. It's just never going to happen like that. But what will happen is what happened with the electric vehicle industry, fleet owners, cargo, mail, things like that, right? Packages, delivery, so on and so forth. Reliable 30, 40, 60, 80 miles routes every single day. And of course, what are we finally seeing now in the industry? And lo and behold, hey, drones carrying cargo, hybrid drones carrying cargo, BV laws beyond visual line of sight for these drones that will fly, by the way, 300 miles, 600 miles, why not? And this is where we're starting to now see, if not the rubber meets the road, the propellers meet the air kind of situation. And then we'll get into the military complex, because that also kind of links into that. Yes, the drone industry is finally booming right now. And you said something right before that corner of the industry, meaning AAM and drone. And I never understood the split between the passenger side and the cargo side, because they are under the umbrella of advanced air mobility.
I think that's an important point, actually. I mean, so I have certainly seen, there is obviously, a small and dedicated, drone specific industry, set of groups that are, been very active. I think in many ways very effective in what they're doing. I think there's some interesting opportunities, though, to think about, because obviously there is crossover in what the technologies are between the drones. I always think of as like they have the added autonomous capability, but the fundamental mechanical aspects of them at this point now we're obviously seeing this merge of, well, we're talking about electric motors, right? And we're talking about advanced composites that make these things lighter, right? And we're talking about sensing, and we're talking about all these things that are cut across regardless of their passenger, non-passenger, autonomous, non-autonomous. So
it's the testing ground. It's the testing ground.
Precisely. So that's again why I think it's very interesting. This is one of the spaces, because of the national security aspect of it, that I think we're getting a kind of a test drive of how some of these policy imperatives and regulatory imperatives are hitting each other, and sometimes working together, and sometimes there's some education to be done. So that's why I'm thinking it's an interesting proxy for this. And I think a great example we see right now is we have these two policy streams happening in the autonomous space that I think are extremely relevant to the broader advanced air mobility. One is the supply chain security piece. So this is the FCC, now we have seen, has taken very strong actions to essentially, I'd like to say, as kind of a catch and release method, to say, if you have your UAS, your drone system, or its critical components, they provide a long list of those. If those are foreign manufactured, de facto, we are now saying, de jure and de facto, those are not authorized going forward to operate in the US unless, and then they give you kind of, ABC exemptions. Now, the reason for this, as we were saying there, this is the China of it all, understanding that there were a number of actions that have been taken over time, whether it was DJI being in the,
In the
crosshairs
crosshair.
specifically, or more broadly, just concerns that there were opportunities for cybersecurity issues, whether there were issues in terms of just the ability for anybody else to establish manufacturing because price undercutting, all sorts of various incentives that came to a head to lead the FCC, which is interesting, again, why it was the FCC to take this action.
Yes.
There were many other regulatory agencies that had a piece of
Of
this.
course.
Homeland Security had a piece of it. Department of Commerce,
Absolutely.
BIS had a piece of it.
Yep.
But ultimately, the lever that was pulled, again, that idea of running faster or tripping somebody, the lever to trip here was pulled by the FCC. So it's something interesting to note there, because
that's a difference. That's a big difference there.
it's a big difference, right? It's a regulatory body that has much, I think, much deeper well to pull from. And
Yes.
It's also one that has very broad, but also very broad coverage, right? So it's an interesting
Exactly
mix of those two. Yeah. So we have that action. So that's we have decided that this is a critical national security threat potentially, and we're going to pull this lever to lock it down. At the same time, though, we also understand, like I said, that part of the reason for this wasn't just a national security threat in terms of we are worried about data exfiltration, about rogue use, et cetera. That's one part of it. But it's also domestic industry. We want to support a domestic industry. Like I said, for a supply chain, the idea, if it's considered a critical industry, something that's important to your national security, you want to establish a domestic supply chain. So part of that is you trip the other guy. Part of it is then you got to help your guys run faster. So that's the other piece of it is, one, some exceptions that were thrown into that action to say, we're going to put in some sweeteners here to say if you can demonstrate, one, that it's either not a national security risk, so you're going to have to put in an approval process and go through that. But the other sweetener being buy American. We're going to put some incentives for your supply chain, you who are making that drone or you who are making a critical component, to say, hey, if you can show that down the chain you are using a bunch of US content, we are going to incentivize that by allowing yours under this. So there right now you see, an opportunity for component suppliers or sub-suppliers even to start getting in the game, because now you can get cleared under this FCC rule.
And this is the shameless plug I have to make right here, which is perfectly in the middle of the podcast, but I have this company. Oh, I love it, love it, love it. So about a year or so ago, I had a startup under stealth mode that was talking about how do we work against, GPS spoofing, things like that for drones and everything. And they will come back now a year later. They're finally talking. And just to point exactly to what you're saying, this situation that has been created right now, of course, against the will of the industry that wants to go forward, make a lot of money quickly, yada, 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 has also created tons of opportunities. And this company has figured out a way to, sure, you can't use your DJI drones, but what if you can use them and they're completely safe and secured for the domestic market because they have a domestic market operating system sort of thing, right? Yep. So this is what they did. And I'm excited when I see things like that, because the tagline of my website is there are more solutions than obstacles. Obviously, every obstacle gives you tons of solutions. You just have to find them. So I'm very excited about that, because now it's doing exactly what I'm assuming was the original idea, is to kickstart the country into, all right, well, let's roll up our sleeves again. Let's manufacture, let's create these people who will be able to do the electric part of it, the engineering part of it, the manufacturing part of it, so on, so forth, which is exactly what needs to happen right now. So I'm just really excited about that. So stay tuned for that, because these guys have a way of saying it. And the impetus was very simple. I've been talking to a lot of sheriff departments, police departments, and they're all saying, look, a DJI is $3,000 to $4,000. I cannot buy, unfortunately, an American-made $10,000 drone that does the same thing. It's just, we don't have the budget for it. We've been defunded. So, and then again, there's the solution that comes in. So I just wanted to say that, because I love what you said. That was perfect.
No, well, and and again, on that piece of it, again, so that's where, like that FCC piece, that kind of exemption piece, there's
Yeah.
also this broader, and again, as we're talking about this, I would encourage anybody to listening to this to think about what this then means potentially for broader similar type actions across a
Yes.
broader spectrum of the advanced air mobility space, because there's also an executive order that was just issued, American drone dominance tech, unleashing American drone dominance. Right, I
Yep.
always get the name right. I wrote it down here. But again, what it is focused on is two things. Again, the tripping part, reducing reliance on foreign supply chains, and that's some of these regulatory actions, but also regulatory acceleration and funding acceleration to improve the domestic industry, the domestic supply chain. Now, again, it's
Bingo.
still in an executive order level, so it's more of a directive at this point, because this is typically what this administration is focused on, is kind of these high-level directives that are establishing kind of the policy framework. But we see something pretty consistent here, which is that they've said, we are identifying this industry as critical to national security. They talk about it in there, as well as critical to economic security. So again, get that dovetail. They mention it specifically there. They talk about eVTOL specifically in it. So it's mentioned in there. They talk about regulatory acceleration specifically in these spaces. So, all right, we're talking about reducing regulatory burden. And then we're talking about some key additional industry promotion efforts, export promotion.
Yep.
Promoting use of AI in it, which ties into some other
Absolutely.
technology priorities, and potential additional funding actions. Now again, they don't name them specifically. This is where again the advocacy piece comes in, but we can see
Hence
again
the word potential, by the way.
Yeah, right. But what we see here now is now a concerted policy effort that's hitting multiple work streams, both on the regulatory, again, restrictive side, as well as the regulatory reduction in burden, as well as funding side, all directed at a specific industry, because again, it kind of hit all those check marks: advanced emerging technology, critical to national security, and viewed as a growth industry that's critical to U.S. economic security. I don't see why we couldn't apply those same things to the broader advanced air
Absolutely.
mobility market. So I think, again, putting that framework and that hat on and thinking about these actions that we're seeing now in this narrower space, just on UAS and drones, I think it is a clear signal to the industry that this is the way to think about the market currently, and probably in the near term, at least, if not in the medium term. So that's kind of that's my grand theory of
yeah.
where we're at right
No, and I think you're totally right. You actually said it really well, and I want to reach out to our listeners and watchers right now, because if you've been following up until now you're getting a really good understanding of the complexity as we went, from the 52,000 foot view to now we're down to about maybe 30, 20,000 feet. Are we going to go one layer deeper than that? Because now we're going to go, that's all fine and dandy, and this is all theoretical work. We want to push the country in this direction, make sure that it's a little bit more independent and on its own feet, not relying on whatever else can happen elsewhere that could destabilize the country. That's the gist. But now we have to add the other element, which had so many repercussions all over the world. It's the militarization of the country, which is very important, because the first thing we did is we told Europe, you guys are on your own. Of course, they're not on their own, but that just sends the message, right? And so the first things that I've seen in less than a year, and granted, these projects had already started before, but man, they were on double 200% efficiency work ever since this new administration came in, is the dual use aspect. And dual use is nothing new, right? I've been going back and forth between here and Portugal for years, and they've been working on dual use aspects of it. But it really kicked in this whole idea of a dual use that serves a national security context. So I wanted to introduce that in there, because that also has a lot of repercussions on the supply chain boogeyman. I wanted to get your point of view on that one, because I'm sure you've got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, well, so that's my kind of my original, entree into this whole world of international trade, even in supply chains, was dealing with export controls. That's kind of where I first put on the hat and said, do I like this? And happened to be something I was really interested in. And what we ended up spending most of our time on for many years was this idea of dual use, right? Of what are we looking at when we're looking at particularly advanced and emerging technologies? Obviously extends beyond that. It can extend to many different industries, but advanced emerging technologies. And how do we want to regulate regulate technologies that have inherently a dual use potential for military or civil use, but also not just how we regulate them, but how we want to promote them. Because that's one
Yeah,
of the
absolutely.
interesting, again, tensions we see noting in the drone space, but there are others. I mentioned AI as well, where we are really coming up against this inherent tension that we have, where
Yeah.
we clearly are identifying whether it be at the top level of, and I think this will be something would be interesting to see as the industry starts to build out, as the broader, eVTOL industry builds out, broader advanced air mobility kind of takes on new shapes and forms, of what we are going to consider the national security risks in there versus, again, the dual use commercial opportunities, right? Because from a regulatory perspective, there's two schools of thought on dual use and how you regulate it for export control purposes. One is the idea of small garden, high walls. So there you just identify the most critical technology. So it may not even be at a platform level. It may be that, okay, unless you're building this thing for, the Department of Defense or whatever it might be, unless that's what it is, and then yes, we're going to consider this type highly export controlled. Other than that, we're only going to pick out some extremely critical technologies, maybe advanced composite materials that can only developed for a military aircraft because they control certain vibrations.
Chipsets.
Yeah, certain chipsets
absolutely.
designed for super high altitude or to nuclear
Absolutely.
hardened, radiation hardened. That's one
Perfect.
where you regulate those very strictly, only to be shared either with very close allies or perhaps not at all. Or the other theory is you have a very broad regulatory purview. And this is kind of historically how export controls have been applied on the dual use side, where you say
it's nothing new.
Yeah, in theory, we regulate all these things. And then we have this very complicated set. And this is where I think for this industry, it's going to be very crucial to see how this plays out. This really complicated set, which ends up, giving great job opportunities for lawyers like me. But this
That's true.
complicated export control regime where anything from a spark plug to a satellite can potentially be controlled. And then you have to spend potentially hours reading through complex regulations, working with the engineers to identify particular specifications, sourcing patterns, understanding, has this been transformed in this country, has been incorporated or not incorporated? And that is another model. And typically, historically, industry perspectives across most industries, and I would say advanced air mobility would have the same perspective as most is, they don't love that model because of the
That's so true.
Because of the uncertainty, not so much because they're worried that their specific products are going to be regulated all the time. It's the lack of certainty and the cost and the time required to do it. So that makes it very hard to establish your supply chains, know who you're dealing with, and then ultimately on your customer side, then understanding, oh God, this thing that I didn't think was export controlled, but because I incorporated this one thing that we think could be controlled or we're not sure, now maybe we can't sell it to our friends here. So that uncertainty has historically in this context been very challenging. So
how tight is it to the platform? How demodular is it, or modular is it? Yeah, those are
exactly. Is it specially designed? That the word that terrifies most people in this industry, particularly legacy aerospace, they hate that term. So what this means now, again, like practically getting down to that, like where as you say, the propeller blades hit the air. I'm going to start using that instead of rubber hits the road. So we'll work with that. And where is that now practically hitting this industry? Is because, at least from my perspective, what I see here is you've got an industry that is incorporating, kind of, as I think the drone context was really useful there, a few elements from key technologies, right? You've got obviously the motors, which are kind of the drivers of the whole thing. You have to have these motors that
Right.
historically were not the kinds of motors that anybody really cared about. It's an electric motor. Nobody really worried about electric motors. Electric motor, generally speaking, not considered critical. But the advances that have been made in electric motor technology, and now where we're starting to have ones that you could say are
Yep.
specially designed for some military use, but also really have a very important use in the civilian side. Those are now things that decisions have to be made. Policymakers are going to have to make decisions on. Obviously, industry is going to have to make decisions on how they push and how they advocate for this. But that's a new space. That's an area where nobody really had to think about it before because it just wasn't considered, again, a critical technology. But now, as we clearly know, it is an extremely critical technology. So that element of it, of this dual, this idea of dual use, it's picking out those key technologies in the supply chain that are either have already been identified. That's a little easier to say, okay, we know policymakers care about this. Now we industry are going to be, it's really important for us to advocate, educate, but also understand the policy imperatives that are coming back to us to understand how we can have a supply chain that allows for providing this critical technology for defense purposes, but also still let us continue to develop this effectively and without this morass of regulations on the civilian side. So that to
Now,
me, that's the key thing.
yeah, and so now we're finally getting at the first principle theory right here now, where we're really at the Achilles heel. Is all of this makes a lot of sense in an economy that works, right? So this is where we're almost coming to the point now. Is all of these CEOs that I've met, all of these founders that I've met, they're all worried about, where's the financing coming from? Will the investors understand all of that good stuff? Rightfully so. And that's why we do a lot of education, because we're trying to explain why this works. And hey, it's aviation, it's aerospace. It takes a decade before you get your returns on profit. So cool your jets. But the questions that many are asking, and this is the unanswerable answer, right? Or unanswerable question is, given the context of the economy, inflation is still rising and will continue to rise. There's no doubt about that. Taxes to keep on going up. How do we make that progress? How do we secure a supply chain, an intelligent and flexible yet secure supply chain in a world where inflation keeps on going up, everything keeps on going up, and investors are a little shy and reluctant because they don't fully understand. So now this is, this is the ultimate bottom line here. And I'm not saying that you have the answers, but that's the answer that we're all trying to come up with.
If I did, we'd be having this conversation, and
Yes.
in a ski chalet
Yes.
in Argentina.
It's cigars and champagne. I'd be in my yacht. You can be in your ski
Yeah.
chalet.
Yeah,
exactly.
But
absolutely.
given that's not where we're at right now, do I have all the answers to that? Obviously not. But I think we do have some signals as to
Yes.
how the industry can better react or best be prepared for that. Because right, I mean, that's, again, I think what you're describing, it's another one of these externalities. Like, you've got the broader economic landscape, both domestically and globally, which we see where the trends are. Obviously
Absolutely.
they can change, but we see where the trends are now, and we also see, though, how quickly those can change. So I think, again, the things that we typically hear from clients saying, we are not, business advisors, we're legal advisors, but we often will look at that sort of that dovetail of what's the policy environment look like on the regulatory side, for instance, what's the policy environment look like on the funding support side, and then what are the broader, kind of economic and, macroeconomic trends. The things that I see or would have said and will continue to say to clients kind of fall into a couple of buckets. One is, which I know I've used this word 2,000 times today and probably will continue to, is uncertainty, right? We're going to continue to have economic uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty more broadly. That's great. But what does that mean? Like, what do we mean by that? What I mean by that is you need to avoid locking yourself in wherever possible. And what I mean by that is financial commitments, production commitments, manufacturing commitments, where you must, to achieve efficiencies, you do that. But to limit those as much as possible, number one, so again, thinking supply chain, identifying opportunities to have flexible or essentially, backup supply chain options wherever possible is critical. Again, it's not always possible, but that in many ways, I think, although it's not what people like to hear historically, is no, we just want lowest cost. That's all we care about, whatever the lowest cost.
Yeah.
And what
Be
I would
careful
say
with
is,
that one, because
yeah,
that got us into the mess we're in. By the way,
right,
China does not make bad quality stuff, right? They have
right.
vases that have survived 5,000 years
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
out
No,
there.
but it was
We've
lower.
asked for all of
Yeah,
that stuff.
yeah,
So now we're
yeah.
saying, we no longer want that. So how do we go about it? So this is what you're saying. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that it? Well, and also thinking about when we talk lowest cost, what do we mean lowest cost today, lowest cost in a year, lowest cost 2 years, lowest cost 10 years? So one is ensuring that your sourcing decisions and your manufacturing, supply chain are taking into account not just the immediate short term, but the, near term,
Yep.
medium term, and long term. That's one basic principle, which again,
Absolutely.
it's not rocket science, but it's something, again, the idea of actually putting that as the first principle,
Yes.
that's changed. That is a significant
That's
change.
it. That's exactly it.
So that would be, I think, one thing. Two is, as we're saying, is advocacy, but advocacy with, specific things in mind. Because there's obviously industry advocacy exists. You do it, excellent job. We're all advocates for our clients and our industry, and
Absolutely.
I think we've made tremendous progress in this space, where a few years ago you could talk to maybe one policymaker who knew what we were talking about. There's a lot more.
That's true.
That's solely through the efforts of industry advocacy. So
Absolutely.
now the question is, now that we've got visibility, and we've got some visibility now, what do we do with it? And how do we use that to anticipate where some of these policy imperatives are going to head, right? And again, this is why I like the FCC drone dominance EO like that. It's a great proxy for thinking about how it can be effective.
Absolutely.
What happened there, again, from our perspective, can't speak in any particular cases, but what we can see there is that there was first this critical national security threat identified, where national security professionals, cybersecurity professionals, people in that side of the policy space said, we have a problem. We are concerned about this. Here's all the evidence going back 10 years that we have some real concerns about the safety and security of the supply chain because of X, Y, and Z. So they kind of got out front on that, right? Now the industry has to react to that, right? And I think they've reacted in a few different ways that we're now kind of seeing how that plays out. And I like to analogize to then what we're going to talk about. We're kind of closing out on here is they have done education, feedback saying, yes, we understand what you're saying. We know about these issues. We have been trying to address them. Here's the things we've done so far. Here's the progress we've made in addressing your concerns. So again, national security concerns, here's what we've done. And then, yes, we understand there's some gaps. So here's our perspective on how those can be effectively addressed. Now, is that going to be exactly what, the FCC and Department of Homeland Security or whoever else, the FAA, whoever else is regulating our space? Probably not. Not on first shot. They're not going to immediately say, yes, you've got it all covered. We trust you. Good to go. But what you can then start doing is that by starting your advocacy approach, by essentially understanding that this is the policy imperative. And again, that's going to be true across the advanced air mobility space. Policy imperative is going to be national security and economic security. That's going to be number one for at least a large and very vocal and very powerful constituency. Got to go in understanding that. And once you understand that, it makes it easier then to identify, okay, well, then where are our opportunities? And I think the big opportunity here is in the idea of then, great, help us establish that domestic supply chain. We want to establish that domestic supply chain. It's better. It's better for many, many reasons. Help us do that. So what are the opportunities to do that? And again, we can see this idea of like better focus on domestic regulation that allows for a marketplace to develop. Better focus on, specific industry regulatory technical issues, whether it be from NIST or whether it be from the FAA, whoever it may be, like where you can work with them directly because you understand the industry. The industry, even the national security professionals on that side, they're amenable to that. They get that. They're like, great, talk to the technical experts. Let's figure out how you can do what you want to do within our framework. And then 3, help us build out the industry, whether that be for funding, whether it be through tax incentives, whatever it may be. there is a playbook here established, and a lot of it starts with acknowledgement of that first principle of, we understand there's a national security concern that you have with our emerging industry. We do too. And that's why we want to build it out domestically. We get that national security imperative. Help us help you do that by making it more functional and working with us. So we've seen this model, and I think that model is one that could be quite effective to think about. Again, it's not one for one. There's obviously differences across the broader advanced air mobility space,
nothing
but
is.
there's a lot of commonalities across the broader space where you could look at that and say, this is the way forward to at least address this aspect of the industry. Obviously, there's other issues we talked about, charging infrastructure, there's all kinds
energy.
of energy.
Oh yes, yeah.
But you can't chew the whole whale at once. And I think this is an area where there is a playbook that I think there's a lot of opportunity for
Agreed.
both. And this is, I think, putting your European hat on there as well, both domestic producers,
absolutely,
as well as for manufacturers and technologies in other countries that are aligned or allied in ways, whether it be through the defense industrial base or commercial, strictly commercial, where they have opportunities to partner with U.S. companies, to partner with U.S. technology, innovators, to be part of this ecosystem, because that's ultimately what they're trying to do, is to establish a different ecosystem that we have now.
Absolutely.
And
it's a different playing field, absolutely, and that's exactly. It's a reshuffling of the deck.
But in the different playing field, we have different players now. We're trying to get. We maybe have a different playing field, but
that's
some of the same rules aren't gone. Like the rules of the game are still rules that we understand. Now we may be I think of it as referees, on a field. Like sometimes they might be, putting out more red cards. They might be, enforcing the physical. We're not going to have a lot. This is not going to be a physical game. So that's the rule we're going to focus on. And then as players, you adjust to that. In other cases, we may be enforcing another. So we're going to be a little fuzzy on the offsides here. And so you adjust to that. So that's what our job is to adjust to those rules. We're still, we're still within the framework of those rules. We just have to understand what the imperatives are, what the priorities are, just accordingly.
Well, Matt, you've said it so well, and I just want to keep a watch on the time here. We're coming up on 55 minutes of us talking, but I want to get more into the personal stuff, because you know what? You are coming back. There's so many more things we need to talk about. Every time you say something, I'm like, oh, we need to talk about this and we need to talk about that. But I want to get more into the who's behind Matt. I mean, what is your motivation? Why do you show up to work every day? What do you look forward to? And then we'll talk a bit, the final future statement after that.
Yeah, I mean, probably some of it's the same for you. I'm always curious. That's always a really good question. Like what why are you willing to put in your time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears into what you do? And I mean, honestly, I know it's weird, but to some folks, it's fun to me. And by what I mean by it's fun, the intellectual exercise of, like we said, I mentioned earlier, it's a Rubik's Cube, and being able to sift through, and for some reason, at 2 a.m, waking up and being like, I see how those pieces fit together. That's fun. That's fun.
Oh, yes.
That is the, what more than anything. I mean, there are other things that obviously I spend my time doing, I'm interested in, but I think about it a lot of times, what's my real joy in life? And a lot of it is just looking at something that looks really disorganized and complex on its surface. And what is this? And then spending a little time thinking about it and noodling around on it, and then seeing how pieces fit together. And that's again, in an emerging and advanced industry, that's completely the whole thing, because everything's new. You may have that playing field. I love this analogy, so I'm gonna go back to it. You may have the playing field that you've got on. You may have, what the sport is, but the players, maybe they move in and out. So you may have different players coming in. You may be on a different field. It's basically the same size, but you may have different field you're now dealing with. You have different referees now. So figuring out the game plan, and that's what it is. It's understanding with the players you now have, with the field you're playing on, with the refs that are in charge and enforcing or not enforcing or emphasizing certain rules, or maybe the rules changed that day, looking at all those things and understanding we're still playing that sport, but how do we
Still
turn that
are.
into a win? How do we take all those pieces together and put it into win? That's why I come to work.
You said it so well. That's exactly that's how I feel. It's a whole futuristic quantum field, and it's like out of that whole thing, something's going to come out. And it's not an ego thing. Somebody else will do it if I don't do it. But I'm just having fun with it, okay? And if anybody else wants to join in, please join in.
Yeah,
That'll be fun. Which is perfect for our closing statement. Basically, is what I wanted to ask you is what would you like people to walk away from with that everything that we've talked about today? Because we really covered a lot of ground today. But what would you like people who are listening or watching us to walk away from today?
I think I would give two top lines. One is again to foot stomp the point before of listen to the policy imperatives, and by listen to them I mean spend time listening to the policymakers, but also policymakers plural, meaning make sure to fit that puzzle together. If you're interested in the industry or working in the industry, making sure you're hearing the full scope of the policymakers that are involved in your industry, and then listen, and really listen to what they're saying, not just on the surface but underneath, because again, that is, as to go back to that analogy, those are the referees. They're the ones setting the rules for the game. You need to understand it.
Absolutely.
As much as you thought you understood what the rules were a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that's not necessarily the answer. So that'd be one. Make sure you understand the rules that are in play right now. And two, again, to foot stomp again what I had said before, is be prepared for uncertainty. And by being prepared for uncertainty, it doesn't just mean sort of worrying about it and thinking, I know it's going to be an uncertain world, because we all do that. I mean, that's, I think for many of us,
human nature,
probably similar age and, background in some ways, like where many of us who are now in, leadership roles in this area came up in a time when maybe there was a little more certainty in a lot of these spaces. Now there's less. Right. So when I say be prepared for, uncertainty is to, challenge be sure you're challenging those assumptions as to what the first principle of what you're doing is. Again, first principle, cost savings. That may no longer be a first principle that you can set off by itself. First principle of, the fastest delivery to customers, the only thing that matters. Does it matter? Yes. But again, is that still the first principle? So being able to challenge your assumptions that you have previously made, because you are living in a more uncertain world, that would be the other top line, because it will make, I suspect, a big difference in how you view, again, your supply chain, your manufacturing operations, and your customer service if you rethink it that way. So those are the kind of the two big things.
I think you nailed it really well, because the one thing that we can be sure of is in this observable universe is everything changes, nothing rests. I mean, that is the one thing that we should be reminded of, that there's no a plateau only lasts for a small amount of time, but change is always around us. So Matt, thank you so much for being with us. It's truly an open invitation for you to come back. I've really enjoyed this podcast a lot, and well, I want to say good luck with everything you're doing out there, because I know you're doing a heck of a lot, and I really do look forward to seeing you again on the podcast.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely have to make time for a follow-up part 2 and see where things are at next time around. Great conversation. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.